Meet Savorista. They have premium craft decaf and half-calf coffee with bold, rich flavor. Made from high-altitude, hand-picked Arabica beans and naturally decaffeinated with water or sugarcane processes, and there's no harsh chemicals.
But if you think chocolate, caramel, citrus, even bourbon pecan and mint and mocha, it's small batch roasted, literally so good, customers call it the best decaf they've ever tried.
Better sleep, less anxiety, all the flavor. Use our code INFOGO to get 25% off at checkout at savorista.com. You can also find that link in the show notes. Hey, William, do you love craft beer?
Yes, I do. We
If you're
can,
looking for the perfect gift for a beer lover or just want to show off your brewery pride, the Harpoon Shop has something you won't find anywhere else.
and here's something special just for our listeners. You can save 25% off just by using our code INFOGO at checkout. You can find that link in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William.
And I'm Kat,
And that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity with every show.
Absolutely. Have you ever heard of petrodollars?
No,
Have you ever heard of petroleum dollars?
no. I've heard of petroleum, of course, and dollars separately, but not together in the same sentence.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into a lot of that history, but do you know how the world trades currency?
I know, like, there's different exchange rates.
Back in the day, there used to be the gold standard. I know we touched on that somewhere, but it doesn't really matter. We'll do an episode on it somewhere down the line because it is what it is. So let's start with the question that most people have never really thought about.
Sure. Why does the entire world use US dollars to buy oil?
Think about that for just a second because oil is pumped out of the ground in places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Venezuela, Nigeria, and then it's shipped across oceans to countries like Japan, Germany, India, South Korea. But yet, when those countries pay for that oil, the money almost always moves through one currency.
The US dollar.
So it's not traded in euro dollars, right? It's not traded in Chinese money. It's not traded in Japanese money, or even in Germany's. Well, Germany would be part of the euro.
Yeah, they switched over
Yeah.
around the early 2000s from the Deutschmark.
Yep. So, all right. So it's not traded in the euro. It's not traded in Chinese currency or Japanese currency. It's traded in the dollar. And here's the strange part about that. The United States doesn't control most of the world's oil, yet somehow the currency of the United States became the lifeblood of the global oil trade.
And that wasn't always the case, though. In fact, the relationship between oil and the US dollar is surprisingly recent. It really began taking shape in the 1970s during the chaotic time of energy shortages, geopolitical tension, and a major shift in the global financial system. Out of that turmoil came something economists now call the petrodollar system.
Yeah, and this is a system where oil is priced in dollars, where oil producing nations accumulate huge reserves of those dollars, and where much of that money flows back into the US, into the United States financial systems. And over time, that system has helped transform the US dollar into one of the most powerful currencies on earth.
It's helped fund governments, shape international politics, influence wars, and even determine the stability of entire economies. But here's where things get interesting. Today, more countries are starting to question that system. Major powers like China and Russia are experimenting with new ways to buy and sell energy without using the US dollar at all. Some nations are exploring digital currencies, regional trade agreements, and alternative payment system that could slowly chip away at the dollar's dominance.
In other words, the system that helped build modern financial power may not be as permanent as it once seemed. So, Kat and I are going to dive into the story of petrodollars, how oil became tied to money, how that relationship reshaped the global economy, and how some economists believe we may be witnessing the first cracks in a system that has dominated the world for nearly 50 years. Because sometimes the most powerful forces in global politics aren't armies or weapons. They're barrels of oil and the currency used to buy them.
Now, before we dive into decades of history, global politics, and economic strategy, let's slow down for a second and answer a very simple question. What exactly are petrodollars? You know, the term sounds complicated, maybe even a little mysterious, but the basic idea is actually pretty straightforward. Imagine countries are like kids on a playground trading toys. One kid has a bunch of toy cars, another kid has action figures, someone else has trading cards. If they want something another kid has, well, they have to trade for it. Now replace the toys with oil.
So some countries have huge amounts of buried oil underground. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, they pump millions of barrels of it every single day. Other countries like Japan, Germany, and South Korea don't have much oil at all, but they need it desperately to power cars, airplanes, factories, power plants, and shipping. So those countries buy oil from countries that produce it. But instead of trading toys, they pay with money. And for the most of the modern era, that money has almost always been the US dollar. So when oil producing countries sell its oil in the global market, it receives payment in, well, US dollars. And those earnings are what economists call petrodollars.
Put simply, petrodollars are the dollars earned by countries when they sell oil. That's it. Oil goes out, dollars come in. But here's where things get interesting. Once those countries receive billions or sometimes even trillions of dollars from oil sales, they don't just leave the money sitting around, they use it. They might buy goods from other countries, they might invest in global markets, they might purchase infrastructure, weapon systems, or technology. And very often they invest that money back into the United States itself, buying things like US Treasury bonds, real estate, or shares in American companies. So, in other words, the dollars used to buy oil often flow right back into the US financial system. So, that cycle is one of the reasons the petrodollar system became so powerful. But here's another big question.
Why dollars? After all, oil isn't American. Much of it comes from the Middle East, Russia, Africa, and South America. So why is the world using the currency of the United States to buy it? And part of that answer is stability. For much of the 20th century, the US had the largest, most stable economy in the world. Its financial markets were deep. Government debt was considered safe, and the dollar was widely trusted. But the real reason oil became tied so closely to the dollar has a lot to do with history, politics, and a series of agreements that reshaped the global financial system during the Cold War. Because the petrodollar system didn't just happen naturally, it was built piece by piece during a period when the world was trying to rebuild after one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. So, to understand how oil and the dollar became linked, we need to go back to a moment when the global economy was being redesigned from the ground up, and that would be the end of World War II.
So, we need to rewind to a very different moment in history. The year is 1945. World War II just ended, and much of the world is in ruins. Entire cities across Europe and Asia have been flattened, factories are destroyed, transportation networks are broken, and national economies are struggling to recover. Looking at each other at the end of the day, what's going on?
World War II was very devastating. I mean, it really flattened Europe.
It
So,
it rocked it rocked the entire world.
absolutely, Africa, I mean, Asia, it truly did. It impacted almost every country in the world.
Hmm, International trade, which was something the global economy depends on, has been severely disrupted. Many countries are dealing with unstable currencies, inflation, and massive war debts. If the world economy is going to recover, leaders know they need a new financial system, one that can stabilize currencies and encourage trade between nations. So, even before the war officially ends, representatives from 44 countries gather in a small mountain town in New Hampshire to design that system. And that meeting would produce what became known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. The idea behind Bretton Woods was simple but powerful: create a stable framework for the global economy so countries could trade and rebuild without constant currency crisis. And under this system, most major world currencies were pegged to the US dollar. That meant their values were fixed relative to the dollar rather than constantly rising and falling in unpredictable ways.
But, and there's always a but, there was another important layer to the system. The US dollar itself was tied to gold. So the United States promised that foreign governments could exchange their dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. In other words, the dollar wasn't just paper, it was effectively backed by the gold reserves held by the US government. And because the United States emerged from World War II with the largest economy in the world and a massive supply of gold, well, many countries trusted the system. So the dollar quickly became the anchor of the global financial system. Bretton Woods also created new institutions designed to help manage the international economy. And one of them was the International Monetary Fund, often called the IMF.
Now, IMS. The IMF was designed to act as a kind of financial safety net for the world. If a country's economy started collapsing or if its currency became unstable, the IMF could step in with loans and guidance to help stabilize things. Another institution created by Bretton Woods was the World Bank. While the IMF focused on financial stability, the World Bank had a different mission. Its original goal was to help rebuild countries devastated by the war and later to support economic development in poorer nations, funding infrastructure projects like roads, dams, and power plants. Well, together, these institutions helped create a system that encouraged international trade, stabilized currencies, and supported economic recovery around the world. And for a while, it worked remarkably well. The decades following World War II saw rapid economic growth in many parts of the world. Trade expanded, industries grew, and the US dollar became the central currency used in global finance.
But there was a catch. The entire system depended on a promise that the United States could always back its dollar with gold. And by the end of the 1960s, that promise was becoming harder and harder and harder to keep because after decades of economic expansion, military spending, and global trade, well, the United States was about to run into a very serious problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think that problem's going to be?
Credit.
Uh,
Credit. So, anyway, for a while, the global financial system built after World War II worked surprisingly well. Countries rebuilt their economies, international trade expanded, and the US dollar became the central global finance. Under the Bretton Woods system, currencies were stable because they were tied to the dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold, right?
yeah,
Right. Sounds good. I like that.
I think
You
that
know,
was a really good reminder of all of the things that were going on because there's going to be a storm brewing.
hmm yeah, we got gold to back it up. It's okay. This paper's good. Anyway, by the 1960s, cracks were beginning to appear in the system. The United States was spending enormous amounts of money. It was funding major domestic programs, expanding infrastructure, and fighting an expensive war in Vietnam. And at the same time, global trade was booming, which meant more and more dollars were circulating outside the US. And the problem was simple but serious. The US government was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them up.
And foreign governments, well, they began to take notice of that. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, countries holding US dollars had the right to exchange those dollars for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. As confidence in the US dollar started to weaken, some countries decided to take the United States up on that promise, and they began converting their dollars into gold. One of the most vocal critics of the system was France. French leaders argued that the United States had an unfair advantage. It could print dollars to pay for goods and services, while other countries had to earn those dollars through trade. So foreign governments started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars. And that created a major problem for the United States because America's gold reserves, they were shrinking fast.
And if too many countries showed up asking to trade their dollars for gold, the United States could literally run out of gold to give them. And if that happened, the entire Bretton Woods system would collapse. So by 1971, the pressure had reached a breaking point. On the evening of August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the American public on national television, and in that speech, he announced a dramatic decision that would reshape the global financial system. The United States would suspend the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. In other words, foreign governments could no longer exchange dollars for gold. This event became known as the Nixon shock, and overnight the Bretton Woods system eventually collapsed. The dollar was no longer backed by gold.
Instead, it became what economists would call a fiat currency. A fiat currency isn't backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver. Its value comes from trust, trust in the government that issues it, trust in the strength of the economy, and trust that others will continue to accept it as payment. So, in other words, it's a trust-based currency. For the United States, this created a new challenge. And without gold backing the dollar, well, the government really needed another way to ensure countries around the world that they still wanted to hold the US dollar and to use them. And the solution to that problem would emerge from an unlikely place. Not Wall Street, not Washington, but the oil fields of the Middle East. And Kat, I say before we get into that, we take a small break.
Sounds good to me.
All right. You drink your Pepsi. I'm going to go get a Coke.
Sounds good. So by the early 1970s, the global.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey, listen up. All of my workforce friends out there, whether you're ranchers, farmers, or you just need a pair of good leather gloves, look no further than Bare Knuckles. The best leather gloves ever made, featuring a patent design crafted for natural curve of the fingers. These gloves deliver a perfect fit, superior protection, and all-day comfort. Made from premium leather, right now get an exclusive 15% off, and you can find that at buybareknuckles.com, but make sure you use our code INFOGO at checkout. You can find that link in the show notes. Upgrade your hands, and remember, every purchase, well, it supports the show, so thank you.
If you love unforgettable treats, you've got to try Molly B's gourmet cookies. These aren't your average cookies. Molly B's brings bold, artisan crafted cookies straight to your pantry. We're talking chocolate, cherry, and amaretto and be cordial. Earl Grey, lavender, white chocolate, and lemon glaze in the tea. Even maple, bacon, whiskey, and white chocolate in the Boss Man. Founded by a single mom from Alaska, Molly Bees has become a national sensation. You get 10% off any product using our code INFOGO at mollybees.com. Find the link in the show notes. The financial system had just gone through a massive shift. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, the Bretton Woods system had essentially collapsed, and the United States needed a new way to maintain global demand for its currency. And the answer, it turns out, would come from one of the most valuable resources on Earth: oil. By the mid 20th century, oil had become the fuel of modern civilization. It powered cars, trucks, airplanes, ships, factories, and electrical grids. Entire economies depended on it, and industrialization spread across the globe, and the demand for oil exploded. Countries needed to, countries needed it to grow their industries, transport goods, and power their cities. And much of that oil was coming from one particular region.
Yeah, the Middle East. Countries in the region were sitting on some of the largest petroleum reserves ever discovered. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE. They were all producing enormous quantities of oil that the rest of the world desperately needed. So, to coordinate production and protect the interest, several oil producing countries formed a powerful alliance in the 1960s called OPEC. And we're going to do a whole episode on OPEC, but we're just going to briefly kind of touch on it here now. OPEC, well, it allowed major oil exporters to work together, set production levels, and influence global prices. And over time, this group would gain enormous power over the world's energy supply. Among the members, one country stood above the rest: Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia possessed some of the largest and most easily accessible oil reserves in the world. Its production capacity made it one of the most influential players in the global energy market. And in the early 1970s, the United States began strengthening its relationship with the Saudi government in a way that would reshape global finance. In 1974, two countries reached a critical agreement. Under this agreement, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars. That meant any country wanting to buy Saudi oil, whether it was Japan, France, or Brazil, would first need to obtain US dollars to complete the purchase.
But the agreement didn't stop there. Saudi Arabia, well, they also agreed to invest its surplus oil profits back into the United States. This meant they could purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, other dollar denominated assets like land, businesses, and in return, the United States provided something extremely valuable: military protection and political support. The U.S. also helped invest in Saudi's infrastructure and development. And this partnership created a powerful economic loop. Countries around the world needed oil. To buy that oil, they needed US dollars. Oil producing nations received those dollars and then invested many of them back into the United States, thus helping the economy. And this agreement became the foundation of what economists now call the petrodollar system.
Oil sales generated massive flows of dollars around the globe, and those dollars reinforced the central role of the U.S. currency in international trade and finance. In other words, oil had effectively replaced gold as one of the forces supporting global demand for the dollar. Was beginning to take shape, a major geopolitical crisis erupted, one that would send oil prices soaring and flood the world with an unprecedented wave of petrodollars. Because in 1973, the global economy market was about to be shaken by an event that would change everything.
And what really happened in the year 1973? Well, it was tensions in the Middle East. They had began simmering for years, and in October of that year, war erupted between Israel and the coalition of Arab nations, including Egypt and Syria. The conflict became known as the Yom Kippur War, named after the Jewish holy day on which the attack began. Almost immediately, global powers were pulled into the conflict. The United States provided military and political support to Israel. In response, several Arab oil producing nations, well, they decided to use the one tool they knew that could put enormous pressure on Western countries: oil.
Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against nations that were supporting Israel, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Netherlands. In simple terms, they stopped shipping oil to those countries. Almost overnight, the global energy supply tightened dramatically, and at the time, many industrialized nations depended heavily on imported oil to run their economies. Cars, trucks, airlines, factories, heating systems, everything relied on a steady flow of petroleum. And when that supply suddenly shrank, the consequences were immediate and dramatic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about it. I mean, gas prices are going to skyrocket. Oil that uses your energy to heat your home, that's going to go up. Like, it's a big deal. Because when OPEC did this, oil prices they just skyrocketed. And before the crisis, oil cost roughly, well, $3 a barrel. And within months, that price jumped to nearly $12 a barrel, an increase of about four times the previous price. And that sudden spike sent shockwaves through the global economy. In the United States, many people remember the images of that time: long lines of cars stretching for blocks outside gas stations. Some stations ran completely out of fuel. Others imposed limits on how much gasoline customers could buy. Drivers waited for hours just to fill their tanks, and governments around the world scrambled to respond. Some countries introduced fuel rationing, others reduced highway speed limits to conserve gasoline. Energy suddenly became one of the most urgent political issues of the decade.
But while oil importing countries struggled with shortages and inflation, oil exporting nations experienced something very different. Their profits exploded. Because oil was priced in US dollars, the dramatic increase in oil prices meant that exporting countries were suddenly earning massive amounts of dollars from global energy sales. These earnings became known as petrodollars, and the scale was enormous. Oil producing countries, particularly in the Middle East, were suddenly accumulating billions and eventually hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. Money was pouring into their economies at a pace the world had never seen before.
But here's the point. Those dollars didn't just stay inside those countries because once oil exporters had all that money, they had to decide what to do with it. And that decision would end up reshaping global finance for decades because the petrodollars flowing out of the oil fields were about to start flowing back into the global economy.
So by the mid 1970s, something remarkable was happening in the global economy. Oil exporting countries were suddenly earning huge amounts of money. Every barrel of oil sold brought in US dollars, and because prices had skyrocketed after the 1973 crisis, those dollars were piling up fast. Countries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, were suddenly sitting on massive financial reserves. But here's the thing.
Money that large can't just sit idle. Governments, well, they don't typically leave billions of dollars sitting in a vault somewhere. That money has to go somewhere. It has to be invested or stored safely or used to buy goods and services. And that's where something economists call petrodollar recycling comes into play. And petrodollar recycling, well, it really describes what happened to all those dollars once oil exporting countries received them. Instead of keeping the money at home, well, many oil producing nations began investing their earnings back into the global financial system. And a large portion of it flowed straight back into the United States and Western countries. One of the most common places those dollars went was the U.S. Treasury bonds.
These are essentially loans to the US government. So when a country buys treasury bonds, it's lending money to the United States in exchange for interest over time. For oil exporters with large dollar reserves, these bonds were seen as a safe and stable investment. Another destination was Western banks, particularly in financial centers like London and New York. These banks accepted the deposits from oil producing countries and then used that money to lend other governments and businesses around the world. In effect, the oil money helped finance global economic activity. And some of those petrodollars also flowed into real estate, infrastructure projects, and corporate investments across Europe and North America.
So, oil rich nations began purchasing office towers, hotels, companies, development projects in major cities around the world. And at this time, another interesting financial phenomenon was growing in the background. Many of those dollars didn't actually return to the United States at all. They stayed overseas in foreign banks. Economists began referring to these offshore dollars as euro dollars. Despite the name, euro dollars aren't necessarily located in Europe. The term simply refers to the US dollar held in banks outside of the United States. This created a massive international pool of dollar dominated money circulating through global financial markets. And the effect of this system, well, it was enormous.
First, it strengthened the US dollar. Because oil exporters were earning and investing so many dollars, global demand for the currency remained extremely high. And second, it helped fund US government spending. When foreign countries bought US Treasury bonds, they were effectively helping finance American deficits. And third, it expanded global financial markets. Banks suddenly had access to huge pools of capital, which they could lend to countries and businesses around the world.
So, in many ways, the petrodollar system created a giant financial loop. Countries around the world needed oil. They bought oil using US dollars. Oil exporting nations received those dollars and then reinvested many of them back into Western financial systems. And that cycle helped reinforce the central role of the dollar in the global trade and finance. And for the next several decades, it would help make the US dollar the dominant currency of the global economy.
So, by this point in the story, the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together. Oil is being sold around the world. Those sales are happening in US dollars, and the money earned by oil producing countries is being invested right back into the global financial system, often flowing into American banks, markets, and government debt.
But why does all that matter? And why is the petrodollar system such a big deal? Well, the answer really comes down to power, economic power, financial power, and global influence. Because when oil is priced in dollars, something very important happens. Any country that wants to buy oil, whether it's Germany, India, Japan, Brazil, whoever, they first need to obtain US dollars.
That means central banks around the world hold large reserves of dollars so they can pay for energy imports. It also means international businesses, energy companies, and financial institutions regularly transact in dollars when dealing with the oil market. The result is constant global demand for the US currency, and that demand gives the United States a unique financial advantage.
Because the world needs dollars. The United States can do something that would be extremely risky for most other countries. It can run large trade deficits. In simple terms, the U.S. can import more goods than it exports and still maintain confidence in its currency. Other nations are willing to accept dollars in exchange for products because those dollars are useful in global trade, especially in the energy market.
Another important part of this system involves U.S. Treasury bonds. When oil exporting countries accumulate massive dollar reserves, they often invest that money in U.S. government debt. These Treasury bonds are widely seen as one of the safest investments in the world. So when countries buy them, they're essentially lending money to the United States government.
And that keeps the demand for the U.S. debt strong and helps financial government spending. Over time, this combination of factors helped turn the U.S. dollar into the dominant reserve currency of the world. But not everyone was happy about that arrangement. One of the most famous critics of the system was Charles de Gaulle, and this was during the 1960s. And he really argued that the international monetary system gave the United States what he called an exorbitant privilege. In his view, the United States had an unique advantage over other nations. Most countries had to produce goods, resources, or services in order to earn currency from other nations.
But the United States could essentially create dollars, spend them abroad, and rely on the rest of the world to continue accepting them. In other words, the US could print money to buy real goods and resources from other countries, something few nations could get away with without damaging their currency. For decades, the petrodollar system helped reinforce that advantage, keeping the dollar at the center of global trade and finance. But global power dynamics are always shifting. New economic powers are emerging, political tensions are rising, and some countries are beginning to question whether the dollar should continue to dominate the world's energy markets. Because today, a growing number of nations are starting to look for ways to change the system.
Yes, so for decades after the 1970s, the petrodollar system, well, it kind of wove itself into the fabric of the global finance. But in the 21st century, cracks cracks have begun to appear, not just small ones, but signs of geopolitical and economic shifts that could gradually chip away at the dollar's dominance. Let's start with the biggest story in the global finance today. China, and his push for what some analysts call the petro yuan. China has been actively promoting the use of its currency in international trade. In recent years, it has encouraged oil exporting countries to settle some energy sales in yuan rather than dollars, including through platforms designed to facilitate yuan based oil trading.
The idea behind the Petro yuan isn't just currency competition. It's a signal that China wants a bigger role in shaping global finance. If major oil producers increasingly accepted yuan, then demand for the US dollar could decline. However, there are challenges. China's financial markets still have capital controls, and the yuan isn't as freely tradable or trusted as the dollar. So a full shift would take time.
Meanwhile, Russia has been experimenting with rubles and other alternatives in its energy trade in response to, well, Western sanctions and restrictions on dollar-based systems. Russia has, well, it's encouraged buyers to pay for oil in rubles or other currencies. and even explored cryptocurrencies and stable coins as a workaround to avoid, well, using the dollar centric financial infrastructure.
And it's not just about currencies. Countries that have faced heavy economic sanctions, such as Iran and Venezuela, have strong incentives to bypass the US dollar entirely because sanctions often block access to dollar based payment systems. These nations, along with others, are experimenting with local currency trade agreements, barter arrangements, and even alternative payment networks that sidestep traditional dollar channels.
Another trend gaining traction is the rise of digital payment systems and central bank digital currencies. Countries around the world, including China, they're exploring and piloting these programs that could make cross-border settlements faster, cheaper, and less reliant on dollar-centric systems. If digital currencies become widely accepted for large-scale trade, including energy transactions that could reduce the dollar's central role, all these developments don't necessarily mean the petrodollar will disappear overnight, especially since most oil sales are still priced in dollars. But it does signal a broader diversification away from dollar dominance that just really didn't exist decades ago.
As the 21st century progresses, the world is slowly moving beyond fossil fuels. Electric vehicles are becoming more common. Solar panels and wind turbines are spreading across cities, deserts, and coastlines, and countries are investing in renewable energy like never before, driven both by economics and climate agreements such as the Paris Climate Agreement. If the global demand for oil begins to decline because electricity is powering cars instead of gasoline, or because green energy sources provide cheaper power, then the central role that oil plays in trade would naturally shrink.
And if oil becomes less dominant as a traded commodity, the money tied to it, like petrodollars, well, could lose some of their outsized influence. But right now, all oil still matters a lot. But the energy landscape of the future is changing, and that could have big implications on the dollar's role in global finance. So, after everything, what really backs the dollar today?
Well, it's not gold anymore. It's trust, which is scary. Trust in the US economy, its stability, and its institutions. You know, that's also scary.
Well, I mean, that's basically what a fiat system is, and I think most of the world runs on a fiat system.
That's insanity to me.
A country can really navigate through hyperinflation and things like that a lot better in a fiat system than it can a goal-based system. If it's tied to something, because resources are limited, they're finite, you know?
I mean, for sure. That's just a lot.
It is a lot. Maybe we do one on the gold standard somewhere down the road. But, I think honestly and truly, you shouldn't really forget the muscle behind it because it's military power and the global financial system that keeps trade and finance flowing.
Plus, the legacy of oil, the petrodollar still echoes in how energy shapes global money.
So the dollar's strength isn't just one thing. It's a mix of economy, power, and history.
For half a century, oil helped power the dollar's global dominance. But as the world changes politically, economically, and energetically, the future of the petrodollar may be one of the biggest financial questions of the 21st century. And an American citizen, that's also scary.
Yeah, yeah, because what would happen is the dollar would decrease, so you would buy less with more, which would cause inflation.
I'm already doing that.
I think we all are right now for sure.
I mean, right. We are all already doing that. We are all already burnt out and barely surviving as it is. It's got to get better from here, I hope. Hopefully, we figure something out.
I don't think the dollar's going to drop off from being traded in oil anytime soon, but it is a watch out for the future.
For sure. For sure. Before we're Marie Antoinette and get beheaded.
Oh my. If you would like to support this podcast,
Click the support link in the show notes.
do you want me to quit taking your lines?
No, you're fine.
Okay. Kat and I want to say thank you for listening.
Yes, whether you're new here or have been with us for a while.
Join the Facebook group at Info on the Go,
And over there, you can share with us your show ideas.
or just simply ask us a question.
Make sure You follow us wherever you get your podcast.
Send us a text using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
You can also email us at
infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
till next time.
Stay curious. Every morning starts with a choice. Don't settle for just coffee. Rise up with strong coffee. Meet the world's strongest cup of joe. Strong isn't just a drink, it's a movement. And strong stands for striving to reach our natural greatness.
Born from one simple need to be better. They rebuilt coffee from the ground up, infusing organic coffee with collagen, protein, nootropics, and functional ingredients that fuel your body and sharpen your mind. There's no crash, no compromises, just clean energy, focus, and flavor that fires you up.
Whether you're chasing kids, chasing goals, or chasing greatness, don't just wake up, rise up. Strong coffee, the world's strongest cup of joe, for a world ready to be better.
Use code INFOGO at checkout to save 15%.